By that, we would like to introduce Josef Schmidhuber, Deputy Director, Markets and Trade Division in FAO. You have been with us before, and obviously we are very interested to hear about, I would say, the things that are going on in the world globally, how it impacts food and fertilizer markets. So please, Josef, the table is yours.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the introduction. I just would like to get a brief confirmation that you can see my screen and obviously hear my voice. Okay, I assume that's the case.
Yes, we can see you, and we can hear you.
And you can see my screen, right? So
yes,
that's perfect then. Okay, thanks a million. Good. So yeah, good afternoon to everybody. I think this is really an opportune moment to pause a little, take stock of the current developments in the markets, and then try to venture with a brief outlook into the next season. My name is Josef Schmidhuber. I'm the Deputy Director of the Markets and Trade Division. I'm very grateful for the invitation by Yara, and I'm very happy to be here. I understand I have 25 minutes, and I have 5 points to cover. The first 4 are a little bit lengthy, and I need at least 5 minutes for each, and the last will be quick. Let me start with a brief overview. So the overall topic is the war in the Ukraine and the impacts on food and fertilizer markets. So I will start with a market situation description. What is the importance of these two countries of Russia and Ukraine for world markets, but also look into the import side. So how many countries are dependent, to what extent, on these two countries. I will then move on to the current market situation, which of course is well described with the wild swings that we've seen in prices, a huge upswing followed by a considerable reduction in prices. It's not quite as wild as it was in 2008, but it's clearly reminiscent of the ups and downs, the boom and bust that we saw back then. I will then move on to fertilizer markets, and I'm very happy to expand the analysis of the fertilizer markets in the discussions. I can only touch on some of the aspects, and in fact, Yara has all the market intelligence of the world, so I don't think there's a lot of need on my side to get into the details, but I'm happy to do so. I will then move on to something that we at FAO have developed, and we think this is really important at the moment. It's a food import financing facility. And I will explain why it is important, what the envisaged division of labor is, and why the Black Sea Agreement needs something like the food import financing facility to complement. And I eventually start with the policy recommendations. Now, let me give you an overview first of how important these two countries are for world markets. And these are facts that are well rehearsed, and you may have seen some of that already, but I think it's nonetheless quite important to recap the importance. No doubt, together, the two countries are the major players in the sunflower seed market. They account for more than 50%, exactly 53% of production if we take the last 5 years as an average. So that's really important. But let me qualify that number right away, because it's been tossed around in the press a lot, and it always is used to purport that the world is completely at the mercy of these two countries when it comes to oil seeds. That's not the case. So sunflower seeds, of course, the oil is important, there is no doubt about that, but it only makes 8% of total oil consumption. And well, sunflower seed may be very specific when it comes to the fatty acids composition, etc., etc. There is a considerable amount of substitutability between different vegetable oils, and so one should not overestimate the importance of sunflower seed, even if the two countries are really important. The two countries are also quite important for barley, actually not so much in terms of production, and as we will see later on, they are more important for barley exports. The same essentially holds for wheat. So two countries together account for about 14% of production, but they account for 29% of exports. It's quite different. They're not important for maize, at least as far as production is concerned, but Ukraine has become a major player in the maize market, around number 3 prior to the war. And perhaps let me add a fun fact. It replaced, for instance, the US in China's market for maize in the last year. So it was actually rather successful in making inroads into the big markets. And the same for rapeseed and soybeans. So the two countries are not that important for the two crops in terms of production. As I alluded to already, it's quite different for exports. So looking into wheat, and that number is probably the best rehearsed number of all when it comes to the war in Ukraine, the two countries together account for 29% of global exports. So that's considerable. And Russia, in fact, is the second biggest exporter. And Russia, again, had a very good wheat crop and overall a very good cereals crop. So it will remain a major exporter and a major player, not least because food and fertilizer are exempt from the sanctions. Turning to barley, I alluded to this already. The two countries are not so important for production, but they're quite important for exports. So they account for 19% of production, but 26% of global exports. As said already, sunflower seeds and sunflower seed oil is really important. And it's 53% of production, but it's even 63% of exports. So quite important when it comes to these commodities, that the two countries are important. And as said, Ukraine is a major exporter of maize. It's number 3, and it was rather successful in making inroads into international markets. Same for rapeseed. One thing that has gained a lot of prominence as of late is actually the importance of Russia in the fertilizer market. It was a widely overlooked fact that Russia is actually the world's most important fertilizer exporter. When we look into the 3 macronutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus fertilizer, and potash fertilizer, and I always use NP and K for the sake of convenience. So Russia was the most important fertilizer exporter in terms of N exports in 2021. The third most important in terms of phosphorus exports, and the second most important in terms of potash. And quite important is the fact that, for instance, that the total potash market is in the hands of a few suppliers. So the 3 key exporters account for nearly 80% of total exports. And the two countries where we have geopolitical tension, so Belarus and Russia together, more than 40% of exports. Why are these things important? Simply because when there is a problem in one or the other market, then actually the whole world market is affected. And it's very similar to phosphorus fertilizer, where Russia plays an important role, and we had problems with exports from China, which is still the case. So together, these two countries are also affecting the phosphorus market in a considerable extent. The reason for that is that both of them are mining products, so it really depends on where the natural availability of these products is. And it's rather different for N fertilizer, simply because N fertilizer at the end of the day through Haber-Bosch is nothing but energy. And so it's much more widely distributed in general in the hands of energy exporters, as we see here, Saudi, Oman, Qatar, etc. Russia, the only major exemption here is China, and that's a bit of a curiosity because China is actually the world's largest energy importer, but it imports a lot of coal to turn that into urea and then export the refined product, as it were, with a considerable profit margins onto the world market. The chart that actually drew the most attention in the press is this one, and there's no chart for which we received more requests for republishing than this one. And it's actually in a way a sad thing, and I will explain why. What you see here is essentially the share, the dependency, the import dependency of individual countries on wheat imports from Russia and Ukraine. So Russia blue and Ukraine ochre. And we see that a lot of countries, particularly countries in sub-Saharan Africa, are heavily dependent on imports from the two countries. Eritrea gets 100% of its wheat imports from the two countries, etc. But I will explain in a moment why that actually is overstating the real problem. But let me first focus on countries that are typically not so much in the focus, and these are countries like Turkey or Egypt, and also Pakistan and Lebanon. You see they get a lot of their wheat also from Ukraine and Russia. However, in the case of these countries, they're really dependent on wheat imports. So as we will see on the next slide, you see a map where we essentially understand where we get the information about how important wheat is in terms of total calorie supplies. And we see it's really important for the Near East North African region, which is heavily dependent for its diet on wheat, but it's not important for Sub-Saharan Africa. Again, this needs to be qualified to a certain extent because Sub-Saharan Africa is heavily dependent on millet and sorghum, and at the end of the day, millet and sorghum markets are linked to other cereals, including the wheat market, and there is no complete decoupling. So indirectly, it's true, Sub-Saharan Africa is heavily dependent indirectly on exports of wheat from Ukraine and Russia. But in general, when we only look at wheat as such, it's not the case. Where the big problems are is really in the nearest North African region, countries like Tunisia, but also Turkey, Egypt, etc., are heavily dependent on imports of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So now here's a curiosity, and we've been making that point time and again. We actually had quite well supplied markets as far as cereals are concerned. And so we ourselves didn't quite understand why prices went up that strongly. But let's have a look at prices first and then explain why prices were high and why prices are coming down. So what we see here, first of all, is the FAO Food Price Index. And we saw this phenomenal run-up until March this year, reaching, a new all-time high, considerable price increases. But the last 4 months actually saw a decline in prices by a considerable margin, and it was for 4 months in a row, and the last month alone was more than 8%. So prices are coming down, and they're coming down particularly for vegetable oils, as you can see here, and they're coming down for cereals as well, and considerably so. So why are prices coming down? Well, obviously, probably the most important factor is the Black Sea Agreement. So this is now factored into the markets, even though the quantities were relatively limited. Now it's clear that there is a commitment to allowing grain and also oilseeds and vegetable oils to come out of Ukraine. And that actually is not only important for the 20 or 25 million tons of grain that were still in stock from the previous crop, but it's more important for the probably near 50 million tons that are being currently harvested. So that's really an important factor, even if the quantities that have left the country, as we will see in a moment, are not that high yet. It's a factor. Then we actually had very good crops in Russia, so very good wheat crop, very good coarse grain crop. And so there is a lot more to come from Russia, not only from Ukraine. So far, the crops for barley and coarse grains, with the exception of maize, and also winter wheat, were not bad in the European Union. That's despite the enormous problems that we have with drought. It will be probably a different story for maize, where yields could be considerably lower. Yields are lower for sugar beet, yields will be lower for potatoes. But for cereals overall, they were surprisingly good, even though the cereals crop, of course, is not yet finished because the maize crop still missing. And that's certainly a factor. On the vegetable oil side, an important factor was in the run-up, actually, and as we see here, was the export restrictions imposed by the biggest palm oil exporter in the world, Indonesia. And as soon as Indonesia realized that there is no domestic shortage and actually prices are even falling, in Indonesia released and discontinued the export restrictions, and we saw palm oil prices falling like off a cliff, and enormously so, nearly by 20% just in the last month. So clearly a factor are these export restrictions, which are not helping anybody really. Then another important factor certainly is sluggish GDP growth. The world is almost in recession, and that certainly weighs on prices. Lower oil prices, they went below $90. Lower oil prices also mean lower demand for biofuels, and that also helps reduce prices. So these are the the key factors that actually have led to the reduction in prices. I'm not saying that I have any idea what prices will do over the next year, and we normally don't make price predictions. All I can say is we predicted volatility, and I'm still pretty sure that there will be volatility going forward. So I alluded to this already, and this is a bit stale. It's from the last crop year, but we haven't really updated this in detail for the current crop year. The supply situation wasn't bad. So there was enough in stock, as we can see here. Stocks to use ratios were high. The exports for wheat, and these are the remaining exports that we calculated in February for the remaining of the crop year until the end of June, were at least as high as the required imports. So there should have been no real strong import gap that would need to be covered. And actually the situation was even better for maize, where the availabilities in the big exporting countries, so US and Argentina, were way bigger than the requirements of the major importers. So overall, we had an access problem. We didn't have an availability problem. That's really important going forward. And for the rest of this presentation, recall that the current problem is still an access problem. It's not an availability problem. Let me quickly get into the fertilizer, and I will really be quick here because you know all of this. But it's important to recall that prices have not really come down as much as cereal prices have come down. It's practically throughout. We don't have the prices for August, but prices for July still suggest, particularly for urea, that we are seeing further action to the upside. And also K and P prices are still high. And that actually means that while we thought affordability would be better come soon, it's actually still declining. It's still very low. And that bodes ill for the next crop, simply because fertilizer is too expensive at the moment. Why is it so expensive? Well, I cannot go into P and K, but let me just look into N. And here it's clear, it's the natural gas price. This is a phenomenal increase in prices. It was a real decoupling as of the second half of last year, with an enormous increase in gas prices. And as we will see in a moment, this is not the end of the line. Actually, gas prices increased even further in Europe, but that's on a monthly basis. So on a daily basis, we are at the new all-time high for TTF gas. And that, of course, means, and of course I'm preaching to the choir here, that the upgrading margins for the big urea producers or end producers more generally are likely to become negative. And we've seen already companies going out of production in the UK and Germany. And I wouldn't be surprised to also learn that other companies are at least cutting back on production. Again, that bodes ill for the end price. And I can imagine that this price drop was not a sustainable price drop, but urea prices and ammonium nitrate prices remain at lofty levels. So I alluded to this already. This, of course, has direct impacts on fertilizer affordability. So it's essentially the real price of food. Here in the red line is essentially the total food affordability line. And we saw that actually was nicely increasing in 2020 and 2021. And that led to a record use of fertilizer with an increase of more than 6% in 21, and then a precipitous fall in affordability, simply because urea prices or fertilizer prices more generally rose faster than output prices. And while that doesn't mean that margins are going down, but for certain products, and particularly rice, as we will see in a moment, they have been going down considerably and they are very low. So our main concern at the moment is not necessarily wheat or maize, it's certainly rice. Good. So I mentioned this already, and the last 5 minutes I would like to spend on something that is really important to us and it's close to our hearts. It's the food import financing facility. So what is it and why do we want to have it? It's actually, I alluded to this already. We don't really have an availability problem in global markets. We have an access problem. So it's the countries that are in need don't have the money to buy. So the idea was, okay, it's fine to have the Black Sea Agreement. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very welcome, but it just helps improve the availability side. It doesn't help the access side. So what we are observing is that more and more countries and more people in these countries are heavily affected by hunger. So it's 193 million people are in IPC 3 and higher. So they are directly affected by hunger. And of course, it's good to get more grain and oilseeds and vegetable oils out of Ukraine, but what we need to do at the same time is improve the purchasing power of these countries. And we in a way, without praising ourselves, we were visionary at FAO. We recognized this early on, and we said, okay, we need something that helps actually the demand side, is not limited to the supply side. And therefore, we essentially suggested to create a special facility for the poor countries that are food import dependent, so that they can purchase food, not only grains, on the world market. And the amount that should be given to these countries that are in need essentially was just enough to offset the increase in their food import bills between 21 and 22. So that, between 2020 and 21. And this is essentially the whole idea of this fifth. And the amount of credit that we calculated was around $25 billion. And if you think of an interest rate, a rebate of about 4%, then this would essentially be $1 billion in actual subsidy needs. So let me move on and explain the rest. So why now? We really see that the food import bills are increasing, and all of the increase is essentially only due to more dollars, not more calories. So when countries are buying and they're paying for their import bills, what we see is that the increment between this year and last year is almost entirely due to more dollars, not due to more calories. And for some countries, the LDCs, the poorest, it's essentially so that the import bill is already declining, and it's mainly because they have very high prices to pay. And so they are in a multiple crisis. They don't have enough foreign exchange. The exchange rates are falling relative to the dollar. They are heavily indebted. And so they are vulnerable from many perspectives, including conflicts and climate and COVID, and they really need support. So we calculated that about 62 countries would be eligible, and it would be 1.8 billion people to benefit. And these are the countries to benefit. So they're all in the low and low middle income category, except for Lebanon and Sri Lanka, which are in a balance of payment crisis at the moment, and therefore they were included, and a few minor upper middle countries, because they are either eligible and therefore they were included. So we have all these documents and they are here, and I would be very pleased if you could read some of that. So again, let me emphasize this, and because it's really important, this is all to improve access to food. It's not necessarily to improve the availability. Now, without being negative on the Black Sea Agreement, let me show you why the Black Sea Agreement is not addressing this. So first of all, I need to emphasize this is super welcome. We love to see this Black Sea Agreement, etc., etc. So it's really important. But looking into the countries who have bought so far, these are all upper middle or high income countries, with the exception of Egypt and a few other countries, and Djibouti. And Djibouti is essentially the port of Ethiopia. But overall, it's mainly corn and it's mainly high income countries. So no doubt this brings prices down. It's super welcome. I don't want to be misunderstood, but in and of itself, it's not sufficient. So what is required is essentially this food import financing facility. So with this, I would like to wrap up with the key policy recommendations. We've seen that export restrictions, be it now for food, be it for fertilizer, be it for fuel, are really bad. And they have created huge swings. It's not only for palm oil, it was also the case for many other food items. They should not be allowed, and unfortunately the disciplines in WTO Article 12 or GATT 11.1 are way too lax to really stop these export restrictions. I think a lot of countries need to understand that they have to diversify their food supplies, and they need to look into many sources, not only Ukraine and Russia, but they need to be less dependent. And the same holds, of course, for fuel, the same holds for natural gas. After all, I'm from Germany. I know how difficult it can be if one relies only on one country for natural gas, for instance. So given the fact that we were first and foremost in an access crisis, that we believe that it's very important to have a tool that improves the access to food, and the food import financing facility is exactly that tool. In addition to that, and that goes in the same direction, one needs to improve the access for vulnerable groups and provide more humanitarian assistance. So we would certainly help or assist further our sister organization, the WFP, in making that case, but also have food safety nets, etc., direct targeted support as a key element of policy recommendations. And finally, and that's what FAO is all about, strengthen market transparency and dialogue and provide timely information. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to entertain questions now.
Thanks a lot, Josef. Very interesting to get this, I would say, very holistic picture about what's going on in the world. And obviously, we have got some questions which is more directed towards the future. You have touched upon the fact that grain prices have been dropping recently. You have also highlighted that the input factors are still at a very high levels. If you could share some thoughts about how do you think those two combined will impact yields and production for the coming months and year?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head here. This is indeed one of our greatest worries. So we do see, we normally deflate the food price index with the MUV, the manufactured unit value, which is a good indicator for getting the real prices in terms of trade. But when we start to deflate our agricultural prices with an energy fertilizer index, as we've done that with the global input price index, then we see that real prices for farmers are not high and rising. They are at middling level or even low, and they have been falling. And this essentially means, in plain terms, that farmers have not necessarily a very strong incentive to increase production. I need to be careful here because, of course, the margins are, in many cases, are still positive, certainly for wheat and coarse grains. And in some cases, they have even been rising. But we know that, for instance, for rice production, they have not been rising. They actually shrink it. And that's of course, a harbinger for lower production in the coming year. Now, the good news here is that the big markets for rice, India and China, have already secured much of their fertilizer, not their, in the case of India, not the P and K, and in the case of China, not the K, but they at least have the N fertilizer to go forward. So we are watching this with great attention.
What about the countries you mentioned that you are putting up specific measures to kind of assist going forward? What about their ability to produce?
Yeah, so that, of course, in sub-Saharan, good. So first of all, we need to understand how important fertilizer is for the different parts of the world. A lot of attention is given to Africa, and there's nothing wrong with this. I don't want to be misunderstood, but Africa only accounts for 3 to 4% of global fertilizer use. It's very important to help these countries simply because undernourishment is very prevalent there. But while doing that, we must not forget that the largest user of fertilizer is actually Asia. And the most populous region in the world is Asia. So from a global perspective, and FAO always needs to take a global perspective, it is very important to have a balanced view and not only focus on Africa, but also look into the situation in Asia. So we would be very worried if countries with a large population and not necessarily full access to fertilizer, like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, etc., being big rice producers wouldn't have enough fertilizer. So it's certainly a concern.